topic that it hasn't been extensively discussed, at least in the perspective of Cypriot archaeology, but it's blooming outside of Cyprus in the rest of the world. So it would be nice at least to see what we can do so that we can extend our horizons a little bit. So because we have the Kariou farm outside that they're going to demonstrate some of the key aspects of the Halloumi production, I'm not going to go very much into detail in the PowerPoint. There's no point. It's much better to actually experience them in person. So what I will try to do today is just give you some general principles about cheese and Halloumi in particular. Then I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what we know about the origins of milk exploitation and cheese, a brief history about Halloumi, and then probably we're going to spend half an hour more or less on walking you through the different archaeological approaches to cheese making and milk exploitation. And I will wrap it up with my little contribution in the end, which, I mean, it made it to a podcast, so it should be okay. So what is cheese? So the term cheese comes from the Latin word quesus, which means correct or perfect thing. And I'm pretty sure for the cheese lovers, this is more or less agreed. But if we think about what cheese is in very general terms, it's just an edible mass that comes out of milk when you use a coagulant. If we see the definition from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, though, you realize that the definition is pretty brief. So there is a lot of different versions of cheese. And it's not just one thing. There is great variability. But if we want to walk through the process of making cheese, we need to start from the principle that a lot of different domains of the human experience or the world experience needs to come together for this food to be produced. So you need the animals, the domesticated animals, with their milk, with their product, with their rennet, with their stomachs sometimes. You need bacteria and plants, because these are the ones that make things move around. And all these need to come together through human ingenuity and creativity. You start from milk. You use the coagulant, which usually, traditionally here in Cyprus, is rennet, is the enzyme chymosin, which comes from the abomasum of a ruminant. In other words, it comes from the fourth stomach of a baby sheep, goat, or cow. But through the literature and through even ancient sources, we know that there are other forms of coagulant that they could use. So you have plant-based coagulants, fig sap, artichokes, thistles, Gaidurangatha. They have been used in the past to separate the milk into whey and curd. And of course, in certain cases, even through the natural acidification of the milk, you could get this separation as well through the bacteria that they grow. So after the coagulation happens, you strain it, and then you end up with two different products. You have whey on the one part, the liquid part, which it has dissolved in it all the lactose. So it would be pretty bad as an experience to consume it straight away, I would assume. But then the other part is the curd. And when you drain the curd, you get fresh cheese. And if you leave the fresh cheese to age through the process of fermentation, it becomes mature cheese, harder cheese, which has even more proteins than the fresh cheese. And it can be stored and preserved for a much longer period. But beyond, and at the same time, for the whey, if you apply heat, and we will see this outside later on, you get whey cheese, which is the equivalent of the anari we have in the Cypriot perspective. Why do we need cheese, though, in the first place? Why not milk? Well, cheese extends the shelf life of milk and all the good stuff that comes from the milk. It can be preserved, at least in the Halloumi case, for even a year, if not even more, in the right conditions. And since it can be commodified in a way, it can be used and exchanged and travel through longer distances as well, which for us archaeologists is actually a very interesting perspective to think about. But why do we want it? Well, I mean, it has a lot of proteins and amino acids. It's good for our immune system. It has calcium, it has phosphorus, it has iron, all these things that are essential and make us feel healthier. This is an amazing website that I found which shows the great variability of cheese across the world. And if you actually go to this link, it's an interactive map. The more you zoom in, the more the variability extends. If you see these small numbers up here, this is the number of different types within a region. So Europe and the US is packed with different versions of cheese. And one of these versions of cheese is halloumi. These are the specifications that come through the website, the official website of the government that are associated with the protected designation of origin for halloumi. What separates halloumi from other cheeses, though, is this part here. After you use the coagulant, you get the separation of the curd and the whey. The curd that gets squeezed is cooked for a second time. And this is something that doesn't necessarily happen with other forms of cheese. And this is extremely interesting. I mean, I'm not going to go through these. You can have a look at it. But I think we have all tried halloumi. We know what it is. But it's one of the many forms of cheese that we have around. So this is the general principles of what is cheese and what is halloumi. If we want to try and understand where it all started, what do we know about the origins of cheese? We actually need to start from a common baseline. So we need to have a common understanding before we move forward. Sorry, I forgot this slide. So this is the general overview of cheese making, and I'm not going to walk you through this, but this is what we are going to try to see outside afterwards. It's the most engaging part because, as you can see, all the red parts that we have there is just waiting time. That's waiting to happen. So I don't think you want to wait for 4 hours. But this part here is extremely interesting, and it hides within it all the experience and the body memory that these people that are doing it for everyday life, it's their life, they train and they learn through time, essentially. So in order to be able to understand the origins of cheese, we need to start with something like this. Can we actually drink milk? Why do we need cheese? The map to the left is a current state of people being lactose tolerant, meaning that people that can drink more than 1 glass of milk as adults and not have stomach problems. And I'm not going to talk more about stomach. And as we can see here, it's mostly in Central and Northern Europe. There is a very high proportion of lactose tolerant people in Central and Northern Europe nowadays, almost 90%, 90 to 100% of the populations. And if you want to know some suggestions, there is different hypotheses of why this is happening. But if you want to know some suggestions, I'm not going to walk you through, but absolutely read this paper by Evershed and colleague. It gives some amazing insights into what kind of processes could have actually happened for people to end up lactose tolerant. But this is the picture we have today. What about the past? This map here that comes from the paper by Evershed and colleagues shows all the aDNA, Asian DNA analysis we have accumulated that has focused on the alleles that are associated with lactose persistent and lactose intolerance. And the red is the lactose intolerant one. And you see that it's more or less evenly spread all around, but this includes the entire, from the 8th millennium up until today. If you see the lower map, which shows the chronological spectrum, we see that lactose persistent appears very sporadically during the Neolithic or from the 5th to the 4th millennium. It becomes slightly more recurrent by the mid of the 2nd millennium, or the mid of the 3rd millennium. But as you see, the curve doesn't really go up, so it's not that much. And it only starts becoming a little bit more substantial around the Middle Ages. So if we want to understand the origins of milk exploitation and cheese, we need to accept the fact that people that did this, whenever they did this, they were lactose intolerant. They couldn't consume the milk. 2 main hypotheses have been proposed for the origins of milk exploitation and cheese and the beginning of cheese. The first starts in the 80s by a very inspirational scholar, Andrew Sherratt, that proposed the secondary products revolution. And within this package, Sherratt suggested that milk exploitation is one of the different components that come together when we get the first urbanized societies around the fourth millennium in the Near East, around the third millennium in Europe. And other secondary products, meaning things that you can get from an animal without necessarily killing it, is, for example, wool, which I guess Julia is going to talk a little bit tomorrow, is animal traction. So milk exploitation, potentially for making cheese, since people couldn't drink more than one glass, so it would have been wasted, according to Sherratt, becomes a real thing around the fourth and third millennium. A couple of years earlier, though, there was another guy named Pugonyi that suggested that milk exploitation actually started with the first Neolithic people. So the moment people domesticated the animals, cattle, sheep, goat, they started exploiting their milk. Based on the current research we have today, it seems that there is a bit of truth in both. So yes, milk has been exploited regularly since the very early Neolithic populations, but there is a thing that happens around the third millennium that makes milk exploitation and probably cheese more important compared to before, or at least more visible. Let's call it more visible. So here we have a map which shows all the lipid residue analysis included in the study of Evershed chronologically, and we see that the earliest lipid analysis, and I will explain what lipid analysis is a bit later, is essentially the identification of milk fats on pots. The earliest ones appear in the Near East, and especially there is a very intensified appearance around northwest Anatolia, around the Sea of Marmaras. And then gradually they expand into Europe as time goes by. Next to it, we have some ceramic sieves, which were first hypothesized that they were used for cheese production based on ethnographical parallels that they have from the Apennines and elsewhere in the Mediterranean. But then more recently, they have actually been analyzed with lipid residue analysis, and they found milk fats in it, which kind of confirmed that they were squeezing something that had milk fat in these things. And the most likely scenario is that this is for producing cheese. On the bottom, though, we have inlaying relief decoration that shows the importance. These are very rich and high-valued material, and they depict actually the exploitation of milk. You have milking, and then you probably have the entire chain operatoire for making cheese or butter. So you see that these kind of products are kind of important in the third millennium Mesopotamia, when we have the earliest kind of urban centers across the world, as far as we know. Beyond all this, though, when the conditions are right, and this is not very regularly, we do get some pieces of cheese preserved archaeologically. This is coming from early Bronze Age China. They found 3 pieces or a couple of pieces of cheese around this mummified, the neck of this mummified individual. They did paleoproteomics analysis, and they identified that these were produced using cattle and goat milk. So some were with cattle, others were with goat. And they also identified through this analysis that we are going to explain what it does later on, that for the separation to happen, these individuals actually used kefir grains. So this kind of cheese probably looked something like this when it was in its original state, which is a kind of cheese that is popular in China up until today. But a bit closer to us, we have a similar kind of occasion in Egypt. Again, at the end of the second millennium, we have some pieces of cheese that they were found in a pot in the courtyard of the tomb of the mayor of Memphis. They did the same analysis. They found that in this case, they have milk that is mixed with cattle and goat and sheep. They couldn't identify what was the coagulating agent that was used for this milk to come together, but they assumed that because they didn't find it, it's probably rennet, and we're going to come back to this. So they suggested that they have a hard cheese, not a softy one. And what was very interesting with this study is that when they analyzed these cheese remains, they found that they contain the proteins, these proteins that are associated with the disease that passes from animals to humans through milk. So it would be nice to speculate that the mayor of Memphis actually probably died from a poison piece of cheese, but who knows? And beyond that, I mean, in the Iron Age, we have mentions in Homer talking about an amazing cocktail that contains wine with some grated cheese on top and some sprinkle of barley on it. We have cheese graters going as back as the early Iron Age in Lefkandi. Anna Georgiadou helped me a couple of days ago that we do have some iconography as well that shows people grading things. We actually have cheese graters, so cheese is part of the whole experience. But what about halloumi? And unfortunately, with halloumi, we are not that informed about its antiquity and its past. There are some speculations or some suggestions of possible objects that could have been used for making cheese, going as back as the early Bronze Age and in the Iron Age, but no analysis has been done to actually confirm that any of these pots would have been used for cheese, and in the same way they can't be used for anything else. So we can only base our work, well, it's not my work, on the written sources, and we can go as early as the 2nd century AD. In the Roman world, we have the Cypriot cheese being pretty famous, according to Lucian. Then Agios Neophytos is the first one to suggest that in Cyprus they used pitia, which is the term that is currently used for the coagulant, pitia, for the halloumi production. So it goes as back as the 12th century, at least our knowledge of the use, but it's also the ancient Greek word that it was used in the mainland for this coagulating agent. And then we only get the word halloumi, and I'm sure Yosif here knows much more than me, around the mid of the 16th century, and it's referred to as a cheese that it was produced only in March. Then a little bit later, they say that this was produced with a mixture of different types of milk. Then in the 18th century, halloumi is pretty famous all across the Near East, or at least this is what's claimed. And in order to avoid the rotting of halloumi by the growing of these little worms that you get in the way as they ferment, as they age, which back then they were calling apidurka, we still call them, and we have phrases in our everyday life about these kind of worms growing within the way that the halloumi is stored. We have an entire monastic economy in the 18th century, if not even earlier, that focuses on cheese. And honestly, probably throughout the entire history, but more clearly by the 18th, 19th century, it seems that halloumi becomes part of the Cypriot identity. And it survives up until today. And now you cannot talk about Cyprus if you don't talk about halloumi. But I need to clarify that I wouldn't even know where to start if there wasn't this amazing paper by Professor Froso Rizopoulou Iomenidou, which summarizes things very nicely. And if you want to know more, definitely go for it. This is where I based this part of the research, and it was more than enough for me at least. And it's amazing, and I totally recommend it. So, okay. So this is the general picture. This is the general principle about cheese, about halloumi. So we establish also that we haven't tested the presence of cheese in Cyprus, at least in prehistory and antiquity. And we only know about its presence probably by the written sources in the Roman world. So how have other people elsewhere in the world approached the question of milk exploitation and cheese? And of course, we should always start with the amazing work by Andrew Sherratt that we mentioned earlier, who based his approach first on iconography, and then in combination with mortality and sex profiles of the faunal record, of the animal bones. And he used these very early kind of approaches of pain that suggest that if you want to exploit milk using animal bones, you will expect that you have a high mortality in the young age, and those animals being mostly males, and then more of the surviving animals into adulthood, they would probably be females. If you actually ask Kyriakos and Nikiforos, though, that they have their own herd for many, many years, this is nonsense for them. This is an idealized model. It would work perfect in an idealized way, but it removes completely the human component from the whole idea. So it was interesting. What I didn't understand about this paper, but it's probably because I didn't read it well, is he uses on the one hand the iconography from the Near East, but then he used final record from Switzerland. And then he mixes everything together. I'm sure there is a reasoning behind it, I just couldn't see it. The idea, though, is that milk exploitation intensifies in the fourth and fifth millennium, and this is part of the whole process of urbanization that happens in this part of the world. Animal bones and essentially mortality profiles have been kept used in the archaeological literature, and there is some use also in Cyprus as well, with the early domestication, suggesting that they could have been used for milk exploitation animals, especially sheep and goats. But I chose to use this paper here by Greenfield and Arnold that focuses on the Balkans. It has a very big data sets of many different sites. They use these really nice ternary graphs. Each dot is a site. It shows the average mortality age for cattle, ovicaprine, and they are distinguished sheep and goat. And circles are Neolithic, triangles are post-Neolithics, probably Bronze Age. So what they see here when they plotted everything together, as you go to the right, essentially, you see the percentages here. It shows the percentage of the age, essentially, of the age of the animals in this kind of, for each average on the side. We see that the Neolithic samples, at least in cattle and mostly sheep, we see that we have Neolithic samples being early age, and then they seem that they preserve the animals more as they move into the Bronze Age, which probably means the more the animals live, the more you can exploit them for their secondary product. When they separated though sheep and goat, they see that goats have been preserved throughout their period, throughout since the Neolithic, for an older age. And they use this pattern to suggest that these animals have been exploited since the very early domestication of them in the Balkans for their milk. So this is an indirect inference that we have a milk exploitation, and because we cannot eat it because we are lactose intolerant, they probably suggest that they made cheese. The second type of work that has been done is focused essentially on morphology and similarities of morphology with the ethnographic record. And we have Bogucci here, a really interesting paper from the 80s. He focuses on this linear pottery culture from Central Europe, 6th millennium BC. We have these sieves. He plots these sieves. He realizes that they're found all across Central Europe, but mostly on small sites, not on big nucleated sites. He draws parallels with what shepherds in the Apennines are using, but then as we can see, there are similar pots all across the world, essentially. And he combines these kind of observations he has here with the faunal record, which when it preserves is associated with cattle. So bringing everything together, he suggests that, okay, we have seasonal sites of pastoralists moving around with their cattle. They milk their cattle there. In order for their products to be viable and economically profitable, they need to make cheese and take them to the nucleated site. This is what he suggested. And then the second paper that I found very interesting, although I'm not entirely sure I agree 100% with it, is Gowin 1997. It's a very interesting paper because he does a similar work as Bogucci, but he uses an ethno-archaeological approach. So he focuses in India and in Pakistan, traditional cheese making in these areas. He records the whole chain operatoire. He tries to draw parallels between the traditional way that these people were making cheese with the material culture we have from the Harappan culture that goes back to the 3rd millennium BC. What it shows, and then he uses this material culture to show for interregional movement of technology, know-how, and products beyond India and Pakistan. What this kind of study does, though, and it makes clear, even though Gowin never really admits it on the paper, is that it shows how difficult it is to use morphology of pots to suggest milk exploitation and cheese making. Yes, you have these sieves, and they look very parallel, but they can be used elsewhere for other things. Yes, you have these cheese graters, or what he suggests as cheese graters, but yes, they could be used for other things as well. So it's very difficult to draw parallels just based on morphology. But this paper is very interesting because it records very systematically the chain operatoire of making cheese in the East, unlike us that we are technically in the West. And before we move to more direct ways of identifying milk and cheese, how much time do I have? Okay, okay. I think we are okay. So I wanted to stop in these two papers that are kind of unicums, at least for me, but I found extremely interesting because we have Puccini on the one hand that uses a linguistic approach, and I'm sure Cassie can correct me if I say something wrong, please. So what he tried to do, as far as I understood, is he focused on the language, the Indo-European languages, and tried to trace back the origins of words associated with cheese and cheesemaking. So he identified, for example, that in these Indo-European languages, it seems that the words used for cheese, they don't have any parallels of what we know about the pre-state, so the previous languages that they were within the region. But he also identified that there is a wide variety of terms associated with cheese. So it seems that there is a lot of variability when we come to cheese and cheesemaking. And he interprets this as a possible Asian neologism. And what is possible neologism? Imagine for people my age and older that we experienced the introduction of computers and technology. Having a mouse and having the animal mouse, how you go from the animal mouse to the actual mouse is this kind of thinking process. So what he suggested is that these people that they were speaking these Indo-Western, Indo-European languages early enough, they went through the same process to end up with the terms that we're having today. So he very briefly presented the words about cheese, and he found three different roots. We have quesus, we have formaggio, we have toma, tumo, tuma, probably diria as well. But he spent most of the times on the renet. So he went to the ancient Greek language and he said, okay, in the ancient Greek we have pitia, that probably comes from an Indo-European root that is associated with the action of to rot and to decay. So probably these people saw the stomachs of the abomasums. We had all these kind of rotten liquids in it, but also within them, they had pieces of curd that they kind of coagulated within the stomachs of these animals as they were only eating milk. And probably that's how they ended up with the word pitia. Tamisos, on the other hand, which is another Greek word, it's probably, as far as I understood, associated with a plant-based rennet. And it has a different root in the Indo-European language, which probably refers to cut, to separate. If you actually talk with people working with milk, if the milk goes bad and it shows curd and whey, they're going to say ekopse, the milk has been cut. I mean, this guy didn't go as far, but he suggested that it could also probably means to separate. So it describes the process of separating curd and whey. And then you have other kind of verbs coming from the Celtic, the Romans, the Germanic languages, which show different actions that could be associated with the process of putting rennet into milk. And then on the other hand, we have written sources. We have Paoletti focusing on 3rd millennium archives from Ur, Umma, and Girsu. And through a very thorough and detailed analysis of these texts from ancient Mesopotamia, we get some very interesting insights about an entire administrative system entrusting cows and goats to herders with an exchange of giving back certain amounts of cheese and butter. We also see that we get some very interesting insights that the administration actually is only interested about these two final products. They don't care what they do with the rest of the side products that they can have. We see some steps in the chain operatoire. For example, we see that probably they didn't use rennet in ancient Mesopotamia. Instead, they were doing both butter and cheese through the same process. They were storing milk to ferment in jars from 2 to 12 liters. But what I personally found very interesting is that it gives you some insights into the end part of the chain operatoire, in the consumption part of the chain operatoire. So they say that beyond the leftovers that probably ended up with the herders after they gave their portion to the administration, these products were mostly used for royal and religious banquets. And we will say, okay, but maybe this is what they're interested in, this is what they're recording. It doesn't necessarily reflect the truth. But it's interesting to see that cheese and butter seems to be one of the many things that come together for this elite culture of Mesopotamia around the second half of the third millennium. And that would explain why we have these relief decorations of the chaîne opératoire of milk exploitation in this society. But beyond all this, still indirect evidence about cheese making, about cheese, milk exploitation, we do have some approaches that show direct evidence for the presence of milk and cheese. The earliest ones is the lipid residue analysis. So through a combination of spectrographic, chromatographic, isotopic, you can actually distinguish the fats that are preserved either within the interior of the pods or absorbed in the matrix in the walls of the pod. You can separate milk fats from meat fats. And then you can even separate meat fats into based on cattle, sheep, and goat, or pig and deer, or whatever. So Evershed again has worked a lot with milk essentially. He did this early paper where he suggested he took all these early samples from the 7th and 6th millennium, all lipid residue analysis, he accumulated everything together, and he realized that there is a very high proportion of milk residues in pods from northwest Anatolia around the Sea of Marmaras, whereas there is much less in other parts of the Near East or Southeast Europe. This could be a bias in the preservation and mixing of cuisines, but for them back then, that they didn't thought about this mixing of different proteins together, of different stuff together, and how this could affect the lipid signature that is left behind. This meant that there is an entirely dairy culture focused in northwest Anatolia, exploiting systematically and using in their food milk, probably making cheese, because they cannot drink that much milk, because they are lactose intolerant. And next to it, we have the proof that these sieves have been used for processing milk, lipid residue analysis of sieves from Poland, 6th millennium, mostly, almost exclusively used for dairy. So they have fats for milk. But this can only tell you that there is milk. The new thing that revolutionized our entire understanding about milk is paleoproteomics. With this analysis, the analysis of Asian proteins, either coming from the residues, so calcified things like this, or from the walls of pods, or even from the tooth, from the calculus that is formed around your tooth, you can find the proteins that are associated, yes, with milk, but also with cheese, specific ones associated with cheese, the caseins, and with whey, this beta-lactoglobulin. You can distinguish from which animals the milk came from, because they have produced different proteins. And they can even, in certain cases, like the Chinese one we saw earlier, say what kind of coagulating agent was used to separate them. And this is an amazing work. I chose this one primarily because Miranda Evans is a friend of mine, and it's a very nice paper. So I wanted to show this amazing work here. So very small sample, yes, but she did this amazing, she used paleoproteomics. She identified both whey and caseins, essentially in all the pods, cattle and sheep and goat as well, in all of them. We have only cheese in certain of them, very little preserved, but then we have other ones that they have more variability. Then she took these samples and she compared them with experimental work done with cheese. And she saw that there is not that much difference between this one, in terms of the composition of proteins, between this sample here and the traditional ones that we have there. So probably this means that these pods were storing produce that was associated with the process of cheese making. But what she also identified is that the specific protein, which I'm not entirely sure, but I think is this kappa casein, has a specific bond in it, which it can show that rennet has been used. And she distinguished from this study that even in the modern samples, the experimental samples, there's very little of that bond preserved. So this makes it highly unlikely that this pond will be preserved in archaeological samples undergoing all these taphonomic processes. And because I understand that Poland may lie a bit far away, same analysis happened in Çatalhöyük, which is a little bit earlier, 6 millennium, if I remember well, yes, 6 millennium. We see an entire array of different proteins appearing on the residues, much less absorbed into the pots. But if you see the proteins here, we have some of them that are associated purely with cheese, but there is this KW22, which is this one here. So we have proteins associated from caprin, sheep, and goat, and it's mostly the whey protein. So they are not only focusing on necessarily on cheese, but they could also be focusing on the whey. And just to wrap up things, all these approaches that we see up until now either focuses on identifying milk or cheese or trying to see the earliest, the origins of milk and cheese. What I found very interesting, and I'm not blaming anyone because I don't even know how possible it would be, is to understand what is the role of this product within a small household. How does it work traditionally? How does it work in a simple society, in a household? Where does the halloumi production, the cheese making, stand within the whole entire social and physical world of these people? And for this, I followed an ethnoarchaeological approach. We have Kyriakos here, we have Panayota outside, and the descendants as well. It's my grandparents, by the way, so I am also doing it. But my main focus was first to understand the histories and their own perception in this process, to understand the nature of the tools involved in the process, but not only how it looked like, how they function, what are the principles behind them, so that we can start thinking about how Asian tools associated with this process would be looking like, and also see the whole chain operatoire and try to understand the social networks, the economic strategies, the transmission of knowledge, the value, the cosmology, how all these things come together as much as we can see on a traditional society, so that when we are targeting archaeological samples, we will be informed of the possibilities and then target our projects accordingly, design our projects accordingly somehow to try and test at least some of these components. So for my approach, in order to be an ethnoarchaeological approach, it needs to have an analogy. I keep very simple principles, just because I'm not targeting one specific case study that I want to draw parallel. I want to think through this example of what are the possibilities in the past. I started with an interview where my main focus was to understand a little bit their own world. And it's one thing, you grew up with these people, but at the same time, you learn so many different things when you ask. And many times we don't ask, and this is sad, and we lose so much. So I learned how they met, how, for example, Panayota moved from here, that she lived up until she was 17, to there. They set up the workshop at the age of 17 in the 70s. How did they got their milk from? They had their own herd. How this fed with all the whole economic strategies that they were using there. How was halloumi then circulated, stored, circulated, because they didn't use a market. So this brings a very nice analogy of how would a simple household in the past make profit, or at least use cheese making, for example, to survive as one of the many economic strategies that they could be having at the same time. Maybe agriculture fails, then you need more halloumi, for example, because it can provide the proteins. And then we sat together on a couple of sessions. I am also making my own now, but I am not trusting myself to show you that. I'm not going to walk you through this. You can feel free to ask any questions. I will be there to translate in Greek as well and translate the answers back. What I wanted to show here is essentially all the red welts. And this is key and important because, yes, it's a 4-hour-long process, more or less, but you don't have to be there all the time. You can do many other things. And this puts a lot of things in perspective about Asian households. This can be one economic strategy, which is combined and mixed with many other things happening more or less at the same time. While you have the cheese in the stove, you do have could do. You can cook, you can spin, you can clean the house, you can do many different things. Just some of the general highlights of that study is essentially we can see that it's an activity that is within the physical and social landscape. We can see that it's not intensification, but it fits with a diversified kind of economic model of these households. All the activities are come together. If something goes wrong, then another one fits together. It affects the other one. It can combine different things. Pay attention when you go outside. All the hand gestures that these people are going to be doing, it's so automatic, it's so natural, but they bear so much experience back for them. What about the consumption and distribution? Well, when there is not a market, your social life matters for your economic choices. And this was important. Kyriakos there went to the Cafenio every morning. He treated somebody with a coffee. He got treated somebody by a coffee. It matters. You make a donation in a big festival. It matters. All these combined with the good quality of the product make that workshop that was established out of nothing in the 70s to surviving for 50, almost 60 years now. And my personal favorite is this part here. Pay attention when you see the process, how many times the sign of the cross is involved in the process. And this is not something that is just automatic. It bears all this meaning that comes without even thinking about it. And it's as important as every other step of the process. And feel free to ask. I asked and I got a really nice answer. So feel free to ask. And that's all. So we went through some general principles of cheese. We saw the global origins of cheese. We saw a little bit the history of cheese, of halloumi in Cyprus, and then all the different archaeological approaches that we can have in cheese for the past, including the little ethnoarchaeological contribution of mine. And I hope, okay, I didn't do that, but that's only 40 minutes. Thank you very much.